Hello, Patreon. Thank you for being here. Last month, I said we would talk about the Nashville A-Team in this month's update, and that's exactly what we're going to do. The stories that get told about country music often revolve around artists who follow their dream to the big city and defy the odds to make it. It's a good story, but the reason most of the stories we hear about country music go that way is because there's a system built on people whose job it is to make it possible for those dreams to come true. These are people who've worked with dozens of legends, dozens of the artists who have their stories told in books and movies, and these people do not often have their stories told in books and movies. And I want to be clear about what I'm saying. It's not that one of these narratives is better than the other or more interesting than the other. I do want to hear that story about the star who came to the city as a nobody, followed their dream, defied the odds, all of that. But I also want to hear about the star makers. I want to hear about the people who are so good at making that dream come true that it actually becomes their job. It's what they clock in to do every day. That's not a narrative that we get as often as the other, which is strange to me because to tell the story of any star maker means you have to at least partially tell the story of multiple stars. By definition, telling the story of any star maker is going to give you so many huge characters to work with. I'll take pretty much any chance I can get to look at things from that perspective, and the Nashville A-Team is exactly that. As with pretty much everything to do with country music, there is a bit of argument over who should and shouldn't be considered an official member of the Nashville A-Team. As usual with me, I'm not very interested in participating in arguments like that. There is no such thing as an officially designated member of the Nashville A-Team. There are a lot of session musicians over the years who any sane person would agree should be considered a member of the Nashville A-Team. I'm not gonna let any sort of were they, weren't they get in the way of the important thing here, which is this is a collection of musicians who recorded with basically every single major artist who ever recorded in Nashville. These are people who can't even remember playing on some of the all-time greatest country songs ever because to them it was just another day in the office and they didn't find out that song was a big deal until months later when it came out and flew up the charts. That's a fascinating thing to me. And there are enough individual members of this group that make it possible to craft a narrative around this. It helps that a few of them manage to sort of transcend their station as session musicians. Charlie McCoy and Floyd Kramer somehow managed to become pop stars. And then you got Buddy Killen, publishing magnate. Buddy and Charlie have written autobiographies. The Country Music Hall of Fame's oral history program came in handy here. They have also featured the A-Team in an exhibit several years ago. There was a lot of really great stuff. And again, these are people who worked in this system for decades. We're talking about people who witnessed several radical changes in the mainstream definition of what country music even was. And they played on all these versions of it. When some new person comes to town to do the new version of whatever country music's supposed to be, they're going to play with these people, and these were the people who played on the last version and the version before that, and so on. To tell the story of the Nashville A-Team is to tell the story of a huge piece of the genre entirely. It's weird to me that this is the kind of thing that always winds up on the cutting room floor. Honestly, that's a huge part of the reason why I started Cocaine and Rhinestones. Is this, to me, is where a lot of the real story is, and it just doesn't often get told. I got tired of reading books and watching documentaries and all of these things that put a spotlight on the people who always have the spotlight put on them, because it's just not the whole thing. Sometimes it's not even a true thing. It is easier to put the spotlight on the people who always have the spotlight put on them. It's easy to recycle the accepted narrative. It's way easier than it is to find and tell the whole story. But every time I found a truth that's missing or been obscured by a deliberate lie, maybe it's more complicated. It's not as easy to tell that whole truth. It certainly doesn't serve the purpose of whoever came up with those deliberate lies. But in my experience, it does make for a more fascinating narrative. Now, I know the big topic of conversation in country music circles right now is the Ken Burns documentary on country music that just aired on PBS. Everyone's got an opinion on it. I'm sure a lot of you are sick of seeing people complain about it. I'm sure some of you, like me, are even sick of seeing people complain about the people complaining about it. Kind of what happens anytime country music gets the pop culture spotlight put on it. The people who always cared about it are sure gonna have something to say about it, you know? I don't feel like it's my job to review that documentary. I've only even seen a few segments of it. I do get the impression there's some kind of idea that whatever gets aired on PBS or whatever Ken Burns puts in one of his documentaries is the version that's going to go down in history for all time. You know, whatever they say goes. I'm not, maybe that was true at one time, I don't know. But I don't know that that's necessarily the case anymore. It's easier than ever for people who are interested to find the truth. I'm also not sure that the point of any Ken Burns documentary has ever been to nail down, you know, this is what really happened here. Here's the real truth about the whole thing. That's never the vibe that I've gotten from one of his projects. It seems to me like he picks the people that he's going to listen to and lets them talk, and they say what they're going to say, and whatever they say is what goes in the project. Whether it's true or correct or missing context, however you want to look at it. It's what you get when you're working with talking heads, you know. This is sort of the way that music documentaries end up being made. And it's funny to me that so many people seem to be watching the documentary as if it was going to be something that it was never going to be. You know, you could have told me 10 years ago Ken Burns is going to make a documentary about country music, and the first words out of my mouth would have been a joke about how much more time Johnny Cash was going to get than anyone. I don't have to watch a second of a Ken Burns documentary on country music to know that's going to be what happens, because that's what always happens, you know? And it looks like there are a lot of people who are watching this thing as if they had a country music bingo card. And as long as their favorite singer got mentioned by the narrator one time, then this was a good documentary. And if that doesn't happen, then it's not a good documentary. You know, as long as this dude says Gary Stewart's name one time, everything's fine. I don't know. I don't get it. I think you've got to take into consideration that this project was at least partially funded by the city of Nashville. So you're not going to get too far off the beaten path here. It's just not going to be a thing. I know you'll remember in the first season of Cocaine and Rhinestones, I expressed some worry over whether or not some things that I was going to say about some difficult truths that I had uncovered may possibly land me in a courtroom. I was honestly worried that I may get sued. I believe what I said was the truth, and I would have gone to court to defend my right to say it, but I was still worried about that. The notion that anyone associated with a Ken Burns documentary about country music would ever have had to express those same concerns is laughable. Nobody on his team was ever going to set out to uncover some hidden truth about any of the things they're talking about. It's just not the point of a project like that, but it is the point of what I'm doing. And the reason I began what I'm doing is that nobody had ever done what I'm doing when it comes to the history of country music. Weed out all of the PR bullshit that's always in this stuff. I will say that I did go watch a couple segments of the Ken Burns documentary. I wanted to see for myself how they approached stories that I had already told when I found out that they were telling some of those same stories. One of the segments I watched was on the Judds. Anyone who listened to the episode of Cocaine and Rhinestones that I made about the Judds knows that a large part of their backstory is what I would call PR bullshit. And if you go watch their segment in the Ken Burns documentary, you're gonna see a lot of that PR bullshit. This is a project that's been in the work for years. I have no idea when they recorded those interviews. It was probably a long time ago. It may have even been before one of the books that I used as a source for that episode was published. So maybe they had no reason to think that version of their story was ever going to be challenged. I don't know. But that's what's in the documentary because that's the kind of thing that ends up in a talking head music documentary. It's just the way that it is. I also watched the segment on George Jones and Tammy Wynette because that's what I've spent the last year of my life working on. And I mean, I'm sure some part of me was worried that Ken Burns was going to cover it all and render the past year of my life a waste of time. And that was about all I needed to see to know that my time is much better spent working on things my way than it would be spent watching that whole documentary series. And it may seem like it takes a long time for me to get this done my way, but keep in mind that the first season of the podcast is about 20 hours long, not counting the Q&A episode. It took however many people were on that Ken Burns project, 6 years and $30 million, that's not a figure that I'm making up, that's real, to make a 16-hour series that I can say, just based on the two segments I've mentioned here, I would regard as a personal failure if those were released as a season of Cocaine and Rhinestones. Again, I'm very aware that what they set out to create is a different thing than what I set out to create, but that's actually the point that I'm making. I'm sure the Ken Burns documentary is mostly good. I'm sure it's mostly a good thing for the genre. I can tell you for a fact it has resulted in an uptick in interest in Cocaine and Rhinestones. I can see how much traffic the website's getting. I can see how many downloads the episodes in the first season are getting, and it's gone up since this documentary has come out. So regardless of whatever is actually in that documentary, I know that it is leading people to the truth. And that brings me to the next thing that I probably have to talk about in this update, which is that the band Midland now has a podcast on Spotify. I'm being contacted by a great number of people who seem to think it's important that I know they're ripping me off. I've had ideas stolen before. Usually all it means is that you're doing something that's good and worth doing, and you should keep doing it because someone else thinks it's going to work for them, whether or not that's the case. I don't believe Midland's podcast is very similar to mine at all. It does look like they're going pretty far out of their way to make it look like it's similar to Cocaine and Rhinestones, but the reality is that it's just not. I can say that last November, I was approached by Spotify. They wanted to know if I would be interested in running a podcast hosted by the band Midland. The concept that was shared with me was a little different than the show it looks like they've decided to make, and neither of these concepts seem to be very similar to what I'm doing with Cocaine and Rhinestones at all. The fact is, I probably would have turned it down no matter what the concept for the show is, because I do feel like it's more important that I spend my time making historical documents the way that I make them rather than producing content. But now Midland has a show that they're calling Set It Straight, and they're promoting it as the members of the band Midland sorting fact from fiction to get to the bottom of all these tall tales and legends of country music or whatever. But the truth is, inside that package, it's just an interview show. I've spoken at length here on Patreon about why I choose not to conduct original interviews when researching the show. I have no intention of beginning to start conducting original interviews without getting back into that whole thing again. It's in one of these past updates if you want to go find it. It seems virtually impossible to me that Midland's podcast won't become a platform for someone to go on that show, use that microphone to spout a bunch of PR bullshit, aka lies, the exact opposite of what they're packaging that show as. That's just what happens in talking head documentaries. That's what happens when you run an interview show. It's unavoidable. And again, the reason I started my podcast is because nobody was doing what I'm doing. It's possible that someone else has started. I am certainly not saying anyone who has is ripping off my idea or whatever. As far as I'm concerned, the more people who are trying to find the truth, the better. The world needs a lot more of that right now. But yeah, I certainly don't think it's an accident that I was offered a job on that show, and after turning it down, that show started to look a whole lot like mine, regardless of whether it is or isn't. It is pretty funny to me that the show is packaged like the members of the band Midland are some sort of honky-tonk detectives getting to the bottom of it all. Basically, it's a joke, so I'm not bothered by it. I don't need anyone to come rushing to my defense on this. I do see how it would be unfortunate if any number of people were to believe that what they're getting when they press play on that show is what it's packaged as. I can't imagine that there are very many people interested in uncovering the truth of country music history who are going to land on a podcast hosted by Midland rather than something that's even titled Cocaine and Rhinestones. You know, one of those things very clearly lets you know what it is. All right, not really sure what to expect in next month's update, but that's probably enough to get me in trouble this month. So y'all take care of yourselves, and we'll be back here soon.